What is going on, everybody? Today I'm going to show you how you can get a body shop quality finish using aerosol spray cans. So what we are going to be repairing is this scratch on the fender of my Chrysler 200. So generally, if you can catch your fingernail in a scratch, it needs to be painted. So the first thing we're going to do is take off as much trim as possible. Now you don't have to do this, but the more you take off, the better you can sand all of your edges and the better the job is going to turn out. On this, we're going to take off the bumper to access the headlight, so we're going to remove the headlight as well and the mud flap at the bottom and push back the splash shield a little bit. Once our panel is torn down, we're going to start our repair. So the first thing we're going to do is wash the entire panel we're working on down with some soap and water and dry it off to remove any dirt and water-based contaminants. The next thing we're going to use is a degreaser. This is Acrosol, so you want a solvent-based wax and silicone remover that's going to take off any waxes or contaminants that the soap and water didn't remove. The next thing we're going to do is apply some sanding paste to a wet gray nylon pad and scuff down the entire fender to get it ready for clear coat. So what we're going to be doing is applying some base coat in the repair area where we'll be fixing the scratch and then clear coating the entire panel. That's the proper way to do it, and that's how they tend to do it in most body shops. There are some exceptions where you blend the clear, but generally it is an inferior repair anytime you're blending the clear. So to do this to body shop standards, we're going to do the entire fender. And you do want to be thorough. This process on a fender like this should take somewhere around 5 minutes, and you want to make sure you go over it very well and pay a lot of attention to the edges because they tend to get neglected inside the wheel well near the bottom. But at the same time, don't be pressing too hard on those edges because you can burn right through them and then you have another paint repair on your hand. The goal here is to have that fender looking matte at the end. So you'll look at that door afterwards and you look at the fender, the door will look nice and shiny, you'll see your reflection, the fender will be dull, and that is what we're going for. Once you're done, you can rinse it off with some water or use some wet rags and make sure you remove all of the sanding paste, and then we are ready to start our repair. So we're going to take some 400 grit sandpaper on a sanding block here, and you should start to see that scratch a little bit better. And we're going to continue to go at it with this block. We'll be changing directions, coming at it from up and down from the side until that paint starts to sort of peel away and feather away. So that could take a few different layers, depends on how deep the scratch is. This one here is not down to the metal, so we're going to just keep going at it. It's through the clear coat, it's through the base coat, and it's through about a bit of the primer. So we're going to keep sanding until that scratch is feathered away and leveled out. And keep in mind that this process is pretty similar across different videos I've done. So if you look at different types of repairs, could be dents or plastic repairs, anything like that, everything is pretty well similar once you get past the repair process. So you can apply something from a different video and then continue on using aerosol primers and aerosol clear coats in place. So if you want to look back at some of that, have a look through those videos, and they should still apply to most of what we're doing here. You can see that the paint layers are starting to separate. Now ideally you want about a ½ inch in between each layer to try and feather each one back. Now I've worked on a lot of these Chryslers in my day, and accomplishing that with these particular primers is next to impossible. So don't beat yourself up too much on that, but that's what ideally will happen. So now that we have our area is sort of ready for primer, now we need to do what's known as back sanding a little bit. And I also have a little tiny scratch near the top that I'm going to kind of work at too. I'll show you in a sec, but that's not going to need any primer. So back sanding is basically, we want to prime that ring, but we want to make sure that our primer is landing on only sanded surfaces, because the primer is meant to stick to 400 grit or coarser, so somewhere between 400 and 240. But we're going to try and keep this as fine as we can. So we're going to use 400 here, and here you can see we have another little scratch here, but it's more in the clear coat, so I don't have to get too crazy with it. We're going to sand it out a little bit. Once I learn that it will sand out of the clear, I'm going to just leave it at that, and we'll refine that scratch after we get primer on the other repair area. Now, whenever I'm working with aerosol products, what I like to do is take a piece of cardboard like this, and we're going to cut a hole in it, which may seem a little weird right now, but just bear with me. What we're going to do is apply our product through that hole. And what that's going to do is help us control where it lands a little bit better. So this is the primer we're going to be using, which is a Spray Max primer. It's a 2K primer. Now, the importance of 2K products is that they have a hardener, just like the Body Shop products do. That is, in speaking of primers and clear coats and some other products, the base coat does not have to be a 2-part base coat, but everything else should have a hardener in it. So that's just like anything you would mix up at a Body Shop and spray. So once you activate it by pressing the cap in the bottom and shake it up real good, you can see we can apply our primer now through that hole, and we have a little bit more control of where it lands. So it's not covering the entire fender, and that was the whole point of this little hole. So we're going to let it flash off about 5 minutes in between each coat, so it should go from a shiny kind of wet look to a drier look, and then it's ready for another coat. And depending on how much primer you need, this is a very minor repair, so we only need a little bit here. Now, that primer we just used was direct to metal, but depending on the particular substrate you're priming over, you need to check the tech sheets of the product you're using and make sure that it is compatible for that. The next thing we're going to do is mask off this vehicle. So we've let that flash off for about half an hour. Make sure the primer's reasonably dry before you attempt to mask. And I'm going to use a plastic here from 3M, cut it out, and apply tape to it. It's a nice quick way of masking. I know your resources might not be the same as mine, so do what you can. Use some regular vehicle masking paper if you want on the entire car, whatever you got. But make sure you cover the vehicle, because the 2-part clear especially will stick to everything. The overspray will get on whatever's nearby. So you want to do this in a well-ventilated area, and make sure there's nothing that you really care about too close to this car that you're painting. So the last thing we need to do before this is ready for paint is sand down our primer. So we've just blocked it down with some 600 grit wet paper. You can do this wet or dry, it doesn't really make any difference. Since I'm in a paint booth here, I'd like to keep the dust down to a minimum. So what we're going to do is use some water paper here. So we're going to refine all of the scratches that are 400 scratches from our previous step using the 600. So change them from 400 to 600 by sanding it. Now, you could go a little bit finer. You could finish off those areas in 800. I'm trying to do this with the minimum amount of sandpapers, and sometimes 800 is a bit of a big jump from 4 and won't properly remove those scratches. So we're going to go all around the outside and refine all of our 400 to 6. The next thing we're going to do is use some 1500 grit in the surrounding areas. Now, my primer actually jumped a little bit higher than I wanted it to. It landed above that style line where it wasn't actually sanded with any 400 grit paper. Now, if I didn't remove the primer from that area, it could potentially lift when we went to apply our base coat in the next step. So you want to make sure any overspray is removed and any primer that's in the spot where it shouldn't be is off that panel. So you can do that with some 1500 grit paper pretty quickly. So we're going to wipe it down one more time, remove all of that water, and at this point here, it is best to have a water-based cleaner to do a final wipe on your panel. You can use the degreaser, but sometimes they are a little bit aggressive and they can smooth out scratches and compromise adhesion a little bit. So if that's all you have, I'd say go for it, but try to track down a water-based cleaner that might work a little bit better here. So we are now ready to apply our first coat of base coat, and you're going to see that I don't have the same control over these aerosol cans as I do on my gun. So the first coat went on a little bit rough, so we're going to just let that dry, and then we'll apply our second and try and fix things up a bit. It's nice to have a tack rag as well. It'll just pick up little nibs and stuff in between base coat. You can use this up until you apply your first coat of clear. Once you apply a coat of clear, don't try and tack it. So here's our base coat, our second coat going on. We're just going to try to blend it out as well along the way. As we're spraying, we're going to fan it out just like we're using a gun and try to flick the base coat down the panel a little bit. We don't want to get it too close to the front edge of that fender or to the top of the fender where it lines up with the hood, or especially near the back edge where it lines up with the door, or it's going to throw the color off. Because even though this is color matched paint, it is not 100% the same color. And if you need more information, I do have some videos on how you successfully match color and why you need to blend. So we're going to let each coat flash off about 5 minutes in between them. And here's our last coat going on. I did fight with splatter a bit, so I brought it a little bit further down the panel because I was trying to cover up a little bit of splatter. So once I started cleaning off the nozzles in between coat, it seemed to go away, but you need to watch out for that. And the last coat you kind of want to dust on like an effect coat where the metallics will land in one direction and everything looks pretty cool. So we are ready for the clear coat. This is the fun part. This is the two-part clear again. So just like the primer, we got to push that button in there, crack in the hardener so it mixes it all in, and then give it a good shake. We're going to give it one more attack here before we apply the clear coat, and again we just let that flash off, maybe about 10 minutes after the last coat. Make sure it's good and dry before you apply your clear coat. If you apply it while it's still wet, you'll probably see an instant problem. Here we have our trigger attached to our aerosol. I like the trigger because it gives me a little bit more control, makes it feel more like a paint gun. And we're going to apply the clear just like in any of the videos I've done showing with a gun. It's going to go on there wet. It's kind of like spraying hot wax. You have to have a certain rhythm, otherwise you're going to end up with dry spray. So if you try to kind of go a little bit here, a little bit there, it's not going to work out. It's going to have dry spray and it's not going to flow. So the clear needs to flow. You can only really explain that if you either watch a bunch of my clear coat videos or you spray it once for yourself. The first coat went on pretty sweet. We're going to need to apply about 2 to 3 coats depending on, I guess, how everything goes on. If you anticipate you're going to need to polish a lot, it's generally advisable that you put on a third. If you're in a really dusty area where you have a lot of dirt coming into the fender, then you're likely going to want a third coat because you're going to be sanding a bunch of that clear off in the polishing steps. Now, every clear is a little bit different, and depending on the temperature and humidity, flash times will vary. So it's usually about 5 minutes. Unless you're using a rapid production clear, then it's probably like 2 to 3. But what you want to do is put your thumb into a wet area. Usually the tape's best, not on the painted part. And once it kind of gets sticky and the paint starts to pull fibers, then it's time to apply the second coat. So here is the second coat going on now. It's going to be the same as the first. We want to make sure everything goes on nice and wet. Spray the offsets first is the best practice. Try to do the inside the wheel wells and on the inside lips of the fender and the front edge of the fender where the headlight would go. And then work your way to the outside and try to get it on there wet and shiny looking. So it's not going to float after. It's usually just going to look the way you spray it at once. So if it doesn't look good coming out, you probably need to put more on. So there's a fine line between too much and not enough. If you start to hammer it on, you'll end up with runs, which you can polish, but they are kind of a pain. And I'm going to go ahead and apply a third coat of clear coat here. Now, 2 is generally all you need. I'm going to go ahead and put this third one on just so we can see what it looks like again going on. And I was having a lot of fun holding that little gun trigger, but you can do that again just with the aerosol without that trigger, but I think it was like $10, and it makes controlling that can much easier, especially for guys like me that are used to spraying with a gun. So keep that in mind. But again, this is the last coat. The last coat's usually the most important because it's going to look exactly like that when you're done. Again, you can polish out all of the mistakes after, but you want to try not to make any, and you can make your life a lot easier on yourself. Alright, so that is going to be it. We're going to let this clear coat dry overnight. Now, drying times depend on the product you're using. If you're using the same ones as I am, you can find the tech sheets on the SprayMax website, and that gives you all of the drying times and whatnot. So generally overnight is long enough to polish it clear the next day. So I'm going to be removing a few dirt specks and such from the fender here in the next video. If you want to stick around and check that out, you can also check out other polishing videos I have if you need to know how to take a run out, which luckily we didn't have on this job. Now, if you're wondering what the finish looks like, we'll make sure you have lots of pictures to see that. It really looks just like the factory door. I mean, that doesn't say a lot because these new cars, the finish isn't that great to begin with. But if you wanted something smoother, you could definitely sand down that orange peel and polish it up in the next step. But you want to make sure you put that third coat of clear on. Now, if you were to do an entire vehicle, I'm sure there's a few people out there wondering, could I do this to my entire car? I'd say it would be expensive. You'd go through a ton of those aerosol cans in the process. I guess you probably could do it, but the clear, you'd have a tough time getting that clear to lay down, and you'd be polishing a lot afterwards. So I mean, I'm not going to tell you no, but if you do it, make sure you send it to me and follow on Instagram at Refinish Network. Check out the website, refinishnetwork.com, and follow me on Facebook. Somewhere, just type in Refinish Network, you'll find it. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.